He looked calm. Too calm. Seat 18E. A man in a dark suit, sunglasses hiding his eyes, a black briefcase by his feet. The flight was routine, Seattle to Portland, until he handed the stewardess a folded note. She smiled politely, assuming it was just another phone number. But then he leaned in and said, low enough for only her to hear, "Miss, you'd better read that. I have a bomb." Within minutes, an ordinary flight became the center of one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history. Before we uncover how this man outsmarted the FBI, hijacked a plane, and vanished without a trace, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Turn on the notification bell too, because this story only gets stranger from here. The afternoon of November 24th, 1971, was unusually crisp in Portland, Oregon. Inside Portland International Airport, people lined up to board Northwest Orient Flight 305, a short 30-minute trip to Seattle. Most were travelers eager to reach family ahead of the Thanksgiving holiday. At the ticket counter, a man approached quietly. He looked to be in his mid-40s, clean-cut, dressed in a business suit with a black overcoat. A black tie with a pearl tie clip gleamed against his white shirt. He wore sunglasses indoors and carried a slim black briefcase. When asked for his name, he said, Dan Cooper. He paid $20 cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle, no ID required. That was normal for the time. He boarded the Boeing 727-100 without incident, heading to seat 18E, a window seat in the last row of the aircraft. The plane itself was notable for its rear air stair, a feature that would soon become infamous. Once seated, Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda, paid in cash, and lit a cigarette. He was calm, courteous. A flight attendant would later say he seemed like a businessman, maybe an executive. At 2:50 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Portland. On board were 36 passengers and 6 crew members, including pilots Captain William A. Scott and First Officer William Radizak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and flight attendants Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper caught the attention of Schaffner. He handed her a folded note. At first, she assumed it was someone flirting. Passengers often pass notes with phone numbers or hotel names. She slipped it in her pocket without reading it. That's when he leaned in slightly and said, "Miss, I have a bomb." Startled, Schaffner opened the note. Printed in neat, all-capital letters, it stated Cooper had a bomb and wanted her to sit beside him. She did. Cooper placed the briefcase on his lap, opened it slightly, and tilted it toward her. Inside, she saw 8 red cylinders, a large battery, and a mass of wires, enough to convince her this was no prank. Then he spoke again, this time laying out his demands in a calm, almost rehearsed voice. "I want $200,000 in cash, delivered by 5 p.m., 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle." He told her to return to the cockpit and relay everything to the pilots, but not to panic anyone else on board. Schaffner moved quickly, walking up the aisle to the cockpit and explaining the situation to the flight crew. Captain Scott notified Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control, who contacted the FBI and Northwest Orient Management. From that moment, Flight 305 became the center of a full-scale federal response. Back in the cabin, Cooper remained calm. He removed his sunglasses briefly. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow would later describe his eyes as kind and intelligent. He showed no aggression. He smiled occasionally. He even paid for his drinks. As the plane continued its short flight, FBI agents and Northwest Orient representatives on the ground scrambled to gather the money. 10,000 $20 bills, unmarked but with recorded serial numbers, were taken from local Seattle banks. The parachutes, 2 reserve and 2 main, were gathered from local skydiving schools and delivered to the airport. As the crew looped the aircraft around Puget Sound to buy time, the passengers were told there was a minor mechanical issue. They remained unaware of the true danger. Just feet behind them sat a man with a briefcase bomb and a plan that would baffle investigators for decades. Cooper reviewed his demands again with Mucklow, emphasizing the importance of following instructions. He also made specific requests for how the plane should land and where the fuel truck should be placed. As the plane began its final approach into Seattle, just after 5:30 p.m., Cooper grew more focused. He asked that the cabin lighting be dimmed. He wanted only the crew to remain on board after landing. He reminded Mucklow to stay calm. By the time Flight 305 touched down at 5:39 p.m., all of his demands had been met. The money and parachutes were waiting. Law enforcement surrounded the airport, but made no move to storm the aircraft. Cooper had warned of consequences. He would soon release the passengers. But his next move would change the course of American aviation history. As the crew prepared for the handoff, they realized the gravity of the situation. They weren't just dealing with a ransom. They were part of a hijacking that would soon become one of the most mysterious unsolved cases the FBI had ever seen. And all of it started with a simple, chilling note handed to a flight attendant at 30,000 feet. If you were that flight attendant and saw that note, would you have believed him right away? Or assumed it was a hoax? Don't miss what happens when the plane lands and Cooper sets his plan into motion. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even loud. As calmly as ordering a drink, the man in seat 18E opened his briefcase, revealing red sticks, wires, and a battery. "I have a bomb," he said again, and this time no one doubted him. It was now past 3 p.m. on November 24th, 1971. Northwest Orient Flight 305 had been in the air less than 15 minutes when everything changed. Dan Cooper, seated in the rear of the aircraft in seat 18E, had just shown flight attendant Florence Schaffner the contents of his black attaché case. She hadn't expected to see 8 red cylinders neatly packed together, connected by wires to a cylindrical battery, the unmistakable outline of what could very well be an improvised explosive device. Without raising his voice, Cooper leaned toward Schaffner and explained his demands. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency to be delivered upon landing in Seattle. He also asked for 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. Additionally, he required a fuel truck to be ready on the tarmac, so the aircraft could be refueled without delay for a second flight. His final instruction: no tricks and no police interference, or he would detonate the bomb. Schaffner relayed the message to the cockpit. Captain William Scott immediately contacted Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control and, in coded language, informed them of a hijacking in progress. From there, the message traveled quickly. Within minutes, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Seattle Police Department, and Northwest Orient's management were all aware of what was unfolding in the sky. As the plane continued its short route from Portland to Seattle, it was ordered into a holding pattern over Puget Sound, giving law enforcement time to gather what Cooper had asked for. FBI agents moved swiftly. They collected 10,000 $20 bills from several Seattle area banks, ensuring the serial numbers were documented on microfilm. The cash, totaling $200,000, weighed roughly 21 pounds and was packed into a standard-issue bank bag. Sourcing the parachutes required extra care. Cooper had specified 4, which indicated to authorities he might plan to take hostages with him. This prevented them from supplying dummy or sabotaged chutes. The FBI retrieved 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes from Issaquah Sky Sports, a local civilian skydiving school, and McCord Air Force Base, ensuring that both civilian and military gear were available in case Cooper noticed anything unusual. Back on the plane, Cooper remained astonishingly calm. He lit a cigarette, ordered another bourbon and soda, and occasionally spoke with flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who had now taken over communication with him. According to Mucklow's later statements, Cooper was never aggressive or panicked. He was respectful, soft-spoken, and even reassuring. At one point, he remarked, "You're doing a good job," and offered to request meals for the flight crew once they landed. While authorities scrambled on the ground, Cooper displayed a deep understanding of aviation procedures. He asked detailed questions about the aircraft's speed and altitude, and gave specific instructions for the next leg of the flight. He wanted the flaps lowered to 15 degrees, landing gear kept down, and the aircraft to maintain a maximum speed of 200 knots. These details hinted that he had either military experience, skydiving knowledge, or both, and he was planning something beyond a simple ransom handoff. The passengers, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of what was happening behind them. As the plane circled the Puget Sound area, they were told there was a minor mechanical delay. Some read newspapers, others chatted or napped. No one realized that just a few feet away, a man sat holding a briefcase bomb, negotiating with federal agents through a flight crew who were doing their best to stay composed. As the hours passed, dusk fell, and it began to rain. The Boeing 727 continued circling as the ransom and parachutes were delivered to the airport. Cooper seemed unconcerned by the delay. He sat patiently, smoking and sipping bourbon. He made light conversation with Mucklow and even requested that the cabin lights be dimmed when the plane landed, to prevent law enforcement from taking a clear shot through the windows. At 5:24 p.m., the message came through. Everything Cooper requested had been delivered. The money was ready. The parachutes were on site. A fuel truck was standing by. The crew relayed this to Cooper. He nodded and gave his approval to begin the descent. At Cooper's request, the interior lights were dimmed, and the passengers were told they'd be deplaning shortly due to the mechanical issue now being resolved. He had one final instruction. All passengers were to exit the aircraft first, leaving only the flight attendants and flight crew on board. He had no intention of leaving just yet. The pilots guided Flight 305 toward runway 16 are at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Cooper reminded Mucklow once more to keep the curtains closed and window shades drawn, reducing visibility from outside the aircraft. He told her he didn't want anyone getting hurt, but he was prepared to act if necessary. At 5:39 p.m., the plane touched down on a remote section of the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles positioned discreetly to avoid provoking the hijacker. Cooper's tone never changed. "As soon as I get what I asked for," he told the crew, "everyone walks away safely." With the plane at a standstill, the crew prepared for the passenger release. Cooper observed everything closely but remained seated, briefcase still by his side. No one could have guessed that this calm, composed man was about to vanish into history, and that the mystery surrounding his identity, his motives, and his fate would still baffle the world over 50 years later. The wheels touched down on the rain-slick runway at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Lights were low, passengers were quiet, and on board, a man with a bomb was about to receive exactly what he asked for, without firing a single shot. At 5:39 p.m. on November 24, 1971, Northwest Orient Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport under the cover of early winter darkness. The plane had circled for nearly 2 hours as the FBI and airline officials scrambled to meet the hijackers' demands. Now it was time to deliver. Cooper's instructions were precise. The aircraft was to taxi to a remote, well-lit section of the tarmac. The cabin lights were dimmed. All window shades in the passenger area were drawn. These steps weren't just for dramatics. They were meant to shield the cabin interior from potential law enforcement snipers. On the tarmac, FBI agents, local police, and airline staff waited with a knapsack filled with $200,000 in $20 bills. Their serial numbers meticulously recorded, along with 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve. Inside the plane, Cooper remained calm and alert. He reminded the flight attendants of his instructions. Only the passengers were to disembark once the ransom and parachutes were on board. The crew would remain with him. The money and parachutes were delivered by Northwest Orient employee Bill Mitchell, wearing plain clothes to avoid escalating tensions. The exchange was handled carefully. Mitchell approached the aircraft via rolling stairway, climbed to the front entrance, and passed the items to flight attendant Tina Mucklow through the forward galley door. There were no sudden movements, no police, no attempt to confront or distract Cooper. With the exchange complete, Cooper allowed all 36 passengers to leave the plane. They exited without incident, most unaware they had been in the middle of a hijacking. Their confusion turned to disbelief once they reached the terminal and saw the swarm of FBI agents and flashing lights. Now, only 5 people remained on board: Captain William Scott, First Officer William Radizak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, Tina Mucklow, Flight Attendant Florence Schaffner. But shortly after the exchange, Schaffner, who had initially received the bomb note, was released as well, leaving Tina Mucklow as the sole flight attendant remaining with the crew and Cooper. As the passengers departed, FBI agents attempted subtle stalling tactics. They asked to inspect the aircraft under the pretense of verifying mechanical issues. Cooper refused. He remained polite but firm. No one else was to come aboard. He reiterated his next set of instructions. Cooper wanted the aircraft refueled immediately, and he gave detailed flight plans for a second leg, this time headed south. His final destination, Mexico City, with a mandatory refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. His demands for this leg of the flight were unusually specific, almost technically professional. He instructed, the aircraft must fly at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. Airspeed must not exceed 200 knots, approximately 230 miles per hour. Landing gear must remain deployed. Wing flaps set at 15 degrees. Cabin must remain unpressurized. These were not casual guesses. Cooper seemed to understand the aerodynamics of a Boeing 727, particularly the model they were on, the 727-100, which had a unique rear stair mechanism that could be deployed mid-flight. This detail would become central to what came next. FBI negotiators, suspecting Cooper might try to parachute out of the aircraft, attempted to dissuade him from his plan. They offered to substitute military-grade parachutes. He declined. They asked to speak to him directly. He refused. He communicated only through Mucklow and written notes, remaining courteous but completely in control. On the ground, the refueling process dragged. The fuel truck was slow to position. Cooper grew irritated but never hostile. He reminded the crew that he'd been patient and expected the same in return. Tina Mucklow would later report that he expressed no threats during the delay, only a growing impatience to leave. During this time, Cooper inspected the parachutes. He appeared to understand what he was looking for, discarding one reserve chute and selecting a different one. He chose 2 parachutes, one main and one reserve, and appeared to prepare them for use. Curiously, the parachutes delivered were a mix of types. One was a military-style chute. The others were civilian sport parachutes. At least one of the reserve chutes was found to be inoperable, intended only for training. This was not a trick by authorities. It had been included by mistake due to the urgency of sourcing them quickly. Cooper, examining the chutes closely, chose not to use that one. He then took the ransom money and placed it in a canvas bank bag, securing it with parachute cords. Observers believe he was preparing it to be strapped to his body during the flight. As the aircraft was slowly fueled, Cooper laid out the final flight plan with the cockpit crew. He instructed the pilots to head southeast toward Reno, maintaining low altitude and airspeed. These parameters were important not only for a parachute jump, but also to ensure the rear air stair could be safely lowered in flight. Captain Scott and First Officer Radizak noted that Cooper spoke intelligently, using proper aviation terms, and seemed familiar with how to override safety protocols. He made one final request. Once airborne, the cabin lights were to remain dim, and the crew was to stay in the cockpit with the door closed. They agreed. By this point, nearly 3 hours had passed since Flight 305 had landed. Cooper had made no mistakes. He'd shown no panic. And now, with the passengers safe and the money in hand, he was preparing for something no one else in commercial airline history had ever attempted. Just before departure, he explained again how the plane was to be configured. Keep the flaps at 15 degrees. Landing gear down. Fly low and slow. The crew acknowledged his plan. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Cooper wasn't planning to reach Mexico at all. If you were planning an escape like this, into freezing winds, total darkness, and rugged terrain, do you think you'd survive? Or was this a leap to certain death? At 7:42 p.m., Flight 305 lifted into freezing rain. The passengers were gone. The cockpit door was locked. Behind it, one man was rewriting aviation history. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Scott guided the Boeing 727-100 to a shallow climb. The lights of Seattle disappeared below. For the next few minutes, the crew's only instructions came from a slip of paper slid under the cockpit door, handwritten in neat block letters by the man calling himself Dan Cooper. It read, maintain 10,000 feet, airspeed below 200 knots, landing gear down, Flaps 15 degrees. Cabin unpressurized. Do not open this door. They followed exactly. The cockpit was tense but quiet. First Officer William Radizak handled the radio. Flight Engineer Harold Anderson monitored the instruments, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow sat behind them, relaying messages. She was the only crew member who had spoken with Cooper directly, and her composure now steadied the others. Outside, wind buffeted the plane. Rain streaked the windshield. The Boeing 727, built for speed and altitude, now crawled south at barely 170 knots. Its gear and flaps creating drag that shook the airframe. Fuel consumption doubled. Range dropped sharply. At 7:59 p.m., a faint thud reverberated through the fuselage. A small amber warning light blinked on the engineer's panel. AFT stare unlocked. Anderson reported it to the captain. Scott keyed the radio. Seattle Center, Flight 305. Our aft stairs are deployed in flight. Roger 305, came the reply. Advise if you require assistance. Negative. We'll continue south as instructed. They could do nothing else. Stepping out of the cockpit was forbidden. Through the next 15 minutes, cabin altitude fluctuated. Outside pressure hammered against the tail. The crew felt buffeting waves as air rushed up the open stairwell. A heavy smell of jet exhaust seeped forward. At 8:05 p.m., Radizak suggested raising the flaps slightly to ease drag. Scott refused. He said 15 degrees. We keep it there. Tina Mucklow recalled later that she sat on the cockpit floor, headset pressed to her ear, listening to radio traffic and the relentless roar from behind. We didn't know what he was doing back there, she said, but we knew he was busy. Then, at 8:13 p.m., it happened. A sudden bump, sharp, distinct, pitched the nose of the aircraft upward. The controls briefly felt lighter, as if weight had left the tail. All three men noticed it simultaneously. Scott stabilized the plane and said quietly, "He's gone." They marked the time in the logbook, 2013 hours. No one saw the jump. The cabin door remained closed, but later radar analysis and wind drift modeling placed the aircraft roughly north of Ariel, Washington, crossing the Lewis River. Below lay miles of timber, deep ravines, and swift water. Ground temperature is almost equal to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds 15 to 20 miles per hour. Rain steady. Visibility 0. It was total darkness. Cooper had chosen to leap from 10,000 feet, in business shoes and a trench coat, burdened with roughly 21 pounds of cash strapped to his torso. He carried one main parachute, civilian, functional, and one reserve that would later prove to be a dummy training chute without working lines. Whether he realized that mistake is still unknown. Inside the cockpit, the crew maintained heading. For nearly 2 hours they flew on, communicating with Seattle Center and Reno Tower as directed. Controllers tracked them across Oregon, noting slight altitude variations consistent with the open stairway's drag. At 9:45 p.m., Reno Approach instructed Flight 305 to prepare for landing. Fuel was low, turbulence mild but persistent. Scott advised they would touch down with the stairs still extended. Standard procedure could not retract them from the cockpit. At 10:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, the Boeing 727 rolled onto the Reno runway. Police cruisers and FBI vehicles surrounded it instantly. Floodlights illuminated the tarmac. Scott cut the engines. The rear stair still hung partly open, rainwater streaming down its steps. Armed agents boarded through the front and rear simultaneously. The search lasted minutes. Every compartment was checked. There was no sign of Cooper, no parachutes, no ransom money, only the tie he had removed earlier, a few cigarette butts, and the lingering scent of bourbon and smoke. Outside, agents examined the tail. The metal around the stair edges was scuffed and bent, confirming a man-sized weight had left the plane mid-flight. Within an hour, FBI Field Commander Ralph Himmelsbach declared an active search zone stretching from Ariel to Lake Merwin, later expanded east toward Mount St. Helens. The U.S. Air Force joined with helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, scanning the wilderness below. But that night, There was no chance of locating a man or a body in such terrain. In the cold rain of southern Washington, somewhere beneath a forest canopy, the trail of D.B. Cooper began. The plane was intact, the crew unharmed, the sky silent once again. Would you call this brilliance or madness? Could anyone truly survive a night jump into freezing wilderness with no lights, no map, and 21 pounds of cash? Like this video, share it with fellow mystery lovers, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The largest aerial and ground search in U.S. history is about to begin, and it will uncover clues that only deepen the mystery of D.B. Cooper. The plane was empty. The parachutes were gone. D.B. Cooper had vanished into the night sky, but he hadn't landed in a vacuum. Below him were miles of rugged wilderness, and within hours the manhunt began. When Flight 305 touched down in Reno at 10:15 p.m., law enforcement had already mobilized. The hijacking had been unfolding in real time, monitored by air traffic controllers, FBI agents, and military radar across multiple states. But now, with Cooper officially gone and the money missing, the question became, where did he land? And more urgently, was he alive? The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately activated its Seattle field office, led by Special Agent in Charge Ralph Himmelsbach, a seasoned interrogator and investigator with a reputation for persistence. Working with the Clark County Sheriff's Office, Washington State Patrol, and the U.S. Air Force, the FBI began mapping a probable jump zone based on flight path data, radar logs, and the exact time of the aircraft's pressure bump, 8:13 p.m. All indicators pointed to a section of rural southwest Washington, specifically the area north of the Lewis River, near the unincorporated logging community of Ariel, just 30 miles north of Portland. The terrain below included forests, cliffs, rivers, and dense underbrush, all made more treacherous by continuous rain, freezing temperatures, and poor visibility. The initial search grid spanned over 18 square miles, centered around Lake Merwin, Yale Reservoir, and parts of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. This was not open country, it was rough, steep, and full of hazards. Starting the very next morning, Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1971, a massive search effort was underway. Ground teams, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and hundreds of volunteers began combing the woods for any sign of Cooper or his gear. Parachute experts from the military and private skydiving schools joined the search, providing insight into what kind of trajectory Cooper could have followed after jumping. They looked for shredded parachute canopies, disturbed treetops, footprints in mud or snow, broken branches, fabric snags on limbs, dropped currency or bags. But no debris field was found, no torn fabric, no fresh prints, no body. Despite extensive coverage by helicopters equipped with infrared cameras and searchlights, the operation was hampered by rain, fog, and heavy forest canopy, which made aerial spotting nearly impossible. The rough terrain forced searchers to move slowly, often on foot, in biting cold and ankle-deep mud. In total, over 200 personnel participated in the early phase of the ground search, including members of the U.S. Forest Service, Army Reserve, and Civil Air Patrol. Local logging companies were contacted in case any of their workers had seen or heard anything unusual, but they hadn't. No one reported a parachute sighting. No noise, no crash, nothing. Investigators even brought in tracking dogs to cover suspected landing zones, particularly near Cedar Creek. But days of rainfall had washed away any possible scent trails. In the weeks that followed, the FBI conducted door-to-door interviews with hundreds of local residents. They collected aerial photos, studied topographical maps, and interviewed pilots familiar with night jumps. They rechecked radar logs and reanalyzed the plane's flight profile. Still nothing. They widened the search zone, then widened it again. But D.B. Cooper had vanished without a trace. The lack of evidence triggered a firestorm of theories, even among professionals. How could someone jump from a jet at night, in a suit and loafers, into near-zero visibility, and leave no footprint, no scrap, no bag, no body? Some investigators were convinced he never survived the landing. The most popular theory was that Cooper landed in deep water, possibly Lake Merwin or one of the nearby tributaries. The weight of the cash, his clothing, and the wind conditions could have dragged him under. In cold water, a body could sink and remain undetected for weeks or longer, especially if it snagged beneath submerged logs or brush. Others believed he struck the trees during descent. A parachute snag at high speed could result in a fatal fall, with the canopy collapsing above the forest floor, making it virtually impossible to spot from above. And yet, there was also a growing camp that believed he survived. Supporters of this theory pointed to Cooper's apparent knowledge of aircraft, parachuting terms, and weather conditions. He had chosen the Boeing 727-100 for a reason. It had a rear stair that could be lowered mid-flight. He had known the exact airspeed and altitude needed for a jump. He had picked the right time, just after nightfall during heavy rain over rural land. To some, it was all too precise to be random. The parachutes, though imperfect, were functional enough to survive a controlled jump. The terrain, while harsh, wasn't impossible. And Cooper hadn't panicked or rushed. He was calm, calculated, and deliberate from start to finish. So what happened? The debate intensified in media and law enforcement circles alike. The jump theory split into two camps. Death theory: Cooper perished in the jump, and his remains simply haven't been found due to terrain, weather, or water burial. Escape theory: Cooper landed safely, buried or hid the evidence, changed his identity, and walked away with $200,000. There was no solid proof either way. The terrain was simply too vast, the rain too heavy, the conditions too perfect for disappearing. One FBI agent would later say, "If he made it out alive, he's the only hijacker in history to pull it off without getting caught." After 45 days of non-stop searching on foot, in the air, and through interviews, the FBI suspended the active field operation. They had no leads, no trace, no body, no parachute. Not even a single $20 bill from the ransom had entered circulation. It was as if he had dissolved into the trees. He vanished like a ghost. But then, months later, hundreds of miles from the suspected drop zone, something surfaced. It wasn't a parachute. It wasn't a body. The plane was empty. The parachutes were gone. The forest had yielded nothing. But there was still one hope for catching D.B. Cooper: the money. In the immediate aftermath of the hijacking, the FBI turned its full attention to the only physical item that might trace the mystery man behind it all: the ransom cash. Cooper had demanded, and received, $200,000 in $20 bills. That meant 10,000 individual banknotes, all unmarked but traceable. Just hours before the handoff, FBI agents had worked frantically with banks in the Seattle area to assemble the sum. But they hadn't just counted the bills. They had photocopied every single serial number using high-speed microfilm equipment. It was meticulous work, completed just minutes before the plane landed. That step would become the core of the Bureau's next move: following the money. Once the flight landed in Reno and Cooper was confirmed missing, the FBI circulated those serial numbers nationwide. They were sent to all U.S. banks, major retail stores, casinos across Las Vegas and Atlantic City, credit unions, currency handling centers, armored transport companies, law enforcement in all 50 states. Anytime someone brought in a $20 bill, it could be scanned against the database. The FBI even provided special Cooper serial number posters to bank tellers and store clerks, listing sequences of the most likely to circulate first. The hope was simple: if Cooper spent even a portion of the ransom, someone would spot it. All it would take was one bill to match, and they'd have a lead. The bills were standard series 1969 Federal Reserve notes. No tracking devices, no die packs, just paper, numbers, and time. The Bureau launched a multi-pronged financial surveillance strategy. Major banks were asked to scan every large cash deposit for Cooper bills. Hotels and casinos were checked regularly. Currency exchanges at airports were monitored. FBI agents personally interviewed hundreds of suspects, asking if they had recently received or handled old $20s. Cash drops and exchanges in known criminal networks were infiltrated, hoping to catch even a small portion of the money. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing. Not a single one of the 10,000 ransom bills appeared in circulation. Not in Vegas. Not in Oregon. not even in remote parts of Canada or Mexico. The serial numbers were too specific, too rare. It was like the money had been swallowed by the earth. The longer the silence continued, the stranger the case became. Had Cooper died with the money still strapped to his body? Had he hidden it in the forest and never returned? Or, the most haunting theory, had he successfully laundered it one bill at a time and simply vanished? FBI analysts considered several possibilities. He buried the money. Perhaps he landed safely, found shelter, and buried the cash until the heat died down. If so, he may never have retrieved it. But no digging sites, disturbed earth, or caches had been found anywhere in the search zone. He lost the money during the jump. 21 pounds of cash, even strapped tightly, would shift weight in freefall. If the bag broke loose, the bills could have scattered in the wind or sunk into rivers. But no money, not even a single loose bill, had been recovered in the wilderness. He died with it on impact, the most accepted theory at the time. The forest was too dense, the terrain too harsh. If Cooper died on impact and his body remained undiscovered, so would the cash. But after weeks of military-level search operations, there were no tracks, no fabric, no bones, no bills. He laundered it slowly and carefully. If Cooper had access to criminal networks, he may have exchanged large stacks for clean currency. But the serial numbers were out there and criminals knew the risk. This method would have required years of calculated spending and extreme patience. Still, no matching bills appeared. He destroyed the money. Perhaps he panicked. Perhaps he knew he was being hunted. But this theory seemed unlikely. Why jump out of a plane with the money, only to destroy it? As time passed, a new problem emerged. The public couldn't stop talking about him. Newspapers across the country ran front-page headlines. Skyjacker vanishes with $200,000. D.B. Cooper, man or myth? Did the hijacker survive the storm? The original name given to authorities was Dan Cooper, but a reporting error changed it forever. A local news wire misidentified him as D.B. Cooper, possibly confusing him with an early suspect from Portland. The name stuck, and so did the legend. TV anchors described him as cool, suave, and unshakable. In some circles, he was even seen as a modern-day outlaw. A man who didn't kill anyone, didn't harm passengers, didn't fire a weapon, and beat the system. Songs were written. Novels were published. People in Portland printed T-shirts. By spring 1972, the FBI still had zero leads, and the money was still completely untraceable. The myth of D.B. Cooper was growing, and for the first time in FBI history, a hijacker might have gotten away with it. If you stole $200,000 in marked cash in 1971, how would you hide or spend it without ever getting caught? What do you think really happened to the money? Like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a mystery this big. His real name, or at least the one he gave, was Dan Cooper. But within hours of the hijacking, newspapers across the country were calling him something else. D.B. Cooper. And that small error would turn a criminal into a legend. In the hours following the November 24th hijacking, the FBI began its search not only in the woods of southwest Washington, but in city directories, arrest records, and known aliases. One of the first things they did was trace the name Dan Cooper, the name the hijacker used to buy his one-way plane ticket from Portland to Seattle. It was a common name. Dozens of Coopers showed up in local databases. One of them, D.B. Cooper, a man living in the Portland area, was briefly questioned and immediately cleared of involvement. He had no connection to the hijacking, no criminal background, and was eliminated as a suspect within hours. But one reporter made a mistake. A journalist working the story in Portland either misheard the name or got it from a police scanner and reported the hijacker's name as D.B. Cooper. That version went out on the national newswire, and by the time the FBI corrected it, the name had already taken hold. Headlines across the country now screamed, D.B. Cooper skyjacks jetliner. D.B. Cooper leaps with $200,000. D.B. Cooper vanishes into storm. Even though the hijacker had never referred to himself that way, the media couldn't let it go. The name stuck, and with it, the myth began to grow. The public was captivated. Here was a man who hijacked a commercial jet, walked away with a fortune, harmed no one, and vanished without a trace. He wore a suit. He drank bourbon. He smoked and smiled and said thank you before opening the rear stairs. He didn't seem like a criminal. He seemed like someone out of a novel. Within days, D.B. Cooper was transformed from a suspect to a folk hero. Across the country, bars named drinks after him. Local musicians wrote ballads. College students wore homemade D.B. Lives t-shirts. In some ways, America needed the myth. The Vietnam War had fractured public trust. The Pentagon Papers were about to be released. Watergate was brewing. And here came a man who challenged authority, pulled off the impossible, and disappeared without hurting a soul. To some, D.B. Cooper wasn't a villain. He was a symbol, and the FBI hated it. Agents within the Bureau were growing increasingly frustrated. Leads were drying up. The money hadn't surfaced. The physical evidence was thin. And now, public opinion was turning Cooper into a Robin Hood-type figure, smart, slick, untouchable. Worse still, the case was becoming contaminated by wild theories. Some claimed Cooper was a military paratrooper, possibly a Vietnam vet with training in nighttime jumps. Others said he was a disgruntled airline employee who knew the 727 inside and out. A few even speculated he was Canadian, pointing to the fact that he requested negotiable American currency, something a U.S. citizen might not bother specifying. Then came an unusual detail from Europe. As amateur sleuths dug deeper into the name Dan Cooper, someone uncovered a French-language comic book series popular in Belgium and France in the 1950s and 60s. The main character? Dan Cooper, a Canadian Royal Air Force pilot who flew high-tech aircraft, performed daring missions, and sometimes parachuted into danger. The fictional Dan Cooper was a heroic figure, and some of his illustrated stunts eerily resembled the real-life hijacking. In one issue, he even jumps out of a plane mid-flight, much like the real Cooper. There was no English-language edition of the comic available in the U.S. at the time. It had never been widely distributed in America. This detail raised a new theory. Could the hijacker have been Canadian or European? Did he name himself after a comic book pilot he admired as a child? The FBI considered it briefly, but found no solid evidence to support it. Still, the comparison stuck in the minds of amateur investigators. The theory spread quickly on message boards, in news columns, and among private detectives. It added another layer to the Cooper mystique. At the Bureau, agents were less interested in comic books and more interested in results. They re-interviewed the flight crew. They examined the hijacker's clothing again. They reviewed security footage from the Portland terminal, but the quality was poor, and cameras at the time captured only limited frames. Cooper had avoided attention, paid in cash, and blended in perfectly. No trace of him was ever recorded at Seattle-Tacoma either. He hadn't driven himself to the airport. He hadn't parked a getaway car. No one remembered him waiting in the terminal. To the FBI's growing frustration, the case was going nowhere. In public, pressure mounted. The media wanted answers. Families wanted to know they were safe flying again. Pilots demanded tighter security measures. Congress began holding hearings on airline safety and skyjackings. The FBI increased its manpower. Tip lines were flooded. Sketches were updated. But it was already becoming clear Cooper had slipped through their fingers. And while agents worked around the clock to find him, the public did something else entirely. They started to root for him. Do you think the media helped Cooper vanish by glorifying him? Or did they make him famous enough to be caught? If he was still alive? For 9 years, there was nothing. No parachute, no gear, no sign of the hijacker or his money. Then, on a cold February day in 1980, an 8-year-old boy dug into the sand along the Columbia River and changed everything. Brian Ingram was on vacation with his family at a remote riverside campground known as Tennebar, just outside Vancouver, Washington. It was Saturday, February 10th, 1980. The boy had been digging in the damp sand along the shoreline, hoping to start a small fire with driftwood when his shovel struck something unexpected. Wrapped in a rubber band and heavily decayed, a small bundle of $20 bills emerged from the sand. Then another, then a third. His parents, thinking it might be counterfeit or planted, took the bundles home. But when they brought them to the FBI field office in Portland, agents froze. They ran the serial numbers. They matched. The bills were part of the original $200,000 ransom given to the man known as D.B. Cooper on November 24, 1971. The total recovered? $5,800, bundled in 3 stacks. One stack of $2,400. One stack of $1,800. One stack of $1,600. Each had serial numbers still partially visible, and they aligned with the FBI's original microfilm list of Cooper's money, meticulously recorded back in 1971. It was the first and only physical evidence recovered from the Cooper case since the hijacking. The discovery made national headlines. D.B. Cooper's cash found by 8-year-old. Hijacker's ransom washes ashore. Cold case heats up after 9 years. Almost overnight, the FBI's dormant investigation was thrown back into the spotlight. Agents returned to Tenna Bar, a narrow sandbar along the Columbia River, just 20 miles west of Ariel, Washington, the presumed jump zone. A new grid search was launched. Sand was sifted. Divers were brought in to scan the river floor. But nothing else was found. There were no bones, no clothing, no parachute fragments, no knapsack, no other bills, just those 3 bundles. The find raised new and conflicting questions. If the money landed in Ariel, how did it end up 20 miles west? Buried in sand near the Columbia River? Had Cooper returned and buried it? Did it wash downstream over time? Or was this all that remained? A clue that Cooper hadn't survived the jump at all? FBI analysts examined the bills under microscope and chemical analysis. The bundles showed signs of prolonged exposure to water, but they were still bound by rubber bands, suggesting they hadn't been underwater for 9 years straight. Rubber degrades in water. These bands had become brittle, but hadn't dissolved. That detail stumped investigators. If Cooper had landed and immediately buried the cash, how had it been exposed to moisture only partially? And why only $5,800, less than 3% of the total ransom? To answer that, the FBI consulted hydrologists, soil engineers, and erosion experts. One theory was that the money entered the Columbia River system upstream, possibly from the Washougal River, which intersects near the suspected jump zone. Seasonal flooding or shifting sandbars might have carried the bills downriver, eventually depositing them at Tenna Bar. But skeptics pushed back. The Columbia River's flow and sediment patterns didn't line up perfectly with the known flight path. Even more strange, the bills were still in bundles, tightly aligned in Cooper's original bank issue arrangement. If the cash had floated down the river, it would have scattered or degraded. The water would have separated the bills long before they ever reached Vancouver. This raised another possibility. Someone buried it. Not Cooper necessarily, but someone who found the money after the jump. Could it have been a local who stumbled across the cash, panicked, and hid it near the riverbank? Could Cooper have survived, buried part of the money as a decoy, and escaped with the rest? Or had the bag containing the ransom broken on impact, scattering the bills over a wide area? No one knew. The only certainty was this: the money had been there for a long time, and Cooper was still missing. Following the discovery, the FBI shifted the Cooper investigation back into high gear. New leads were pursued. Old suspects re-interviewed. Tips flooded in again. Some claimed they saw parachutes in trees. Others were sure Cooper was their neighbor, their coworker, or even their father. But none of it led anywhere. A forensic analysis of the tie Cooper left behind on the plane, which had been in evidence storage since 1971, yielded traces of titanium, a rare industrial element used in specialized manufacturing. This led some agents to believe Cooper may have worked in the aerospace sector, possibly Boeing itself. But even this lead fizzled. As for the boy who found the money, Brian Ingram, he was allowed to keep a portion of the bills after the FBI finished their investigation. In 2008, now a grown man, he auctioned off some of the surviving bills to collectors. Others remain in evidence. The discovery at Tenna Bar would go down as the single biggest break in the D.B. Cooper case. And yet, it brought no answers. No trail. No body. No evidence of where Cooper landed or if he lived. just $5,800 in wet 20s. And more questions than before. The Cooper didn't bury the money at Tena Bar. Who did? And why take only $5,800? Like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. The FBI's most promising leads begin to take shape. But none of them can prove one thing. Who was D.B. Cooper? He had no name, no confirmed face, no traceable past. But over the next 2 decades, hundreds of men were questioned, dozens investigated, and one name kept rising to the top. Was D.B. Cooper caught and then forgotten? After the Tena Bar discovery in 1980, the FBI had hard proof that the Cooper money had made it to the ground. But they still had no body, no parachute, no confirmed identity. They had a partial sketch, a clip-on tie, and cigarette butts. That was it. So they did what any agency would. They hunted suspects, and the list grew quickly. From 1972 through the 1990s, the Bureau investigated over 800 people in connection with the Cooper case. Most were ruled out through basic interviews. A few made it further. Only one came close to being called a true match. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. McCoy's hijacking came just 5 months after Cooper's. On April 7, 1972, the 29-year-old former Army helicopter pilot boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver, carrying a hand grenade and a pistol. He handed a note to the flight attendant demanding $500,000 for parachutes and a diversion to San Francisco. Once the demands were met, McCoy jumped from the rear of the plane, also a Boeing 727, using a parachute just like Cooper had. But McCoy made some key mistakes. He left behind a handwritten note with his actual handwriting. He drank a specific brand of drink that linked to local purchases. And he even left fingerprints on the in-flight magazine. He was arrested just 2 days later in Provo, Utah. The FBI recovered a parachute and over $499,000 of the ransom. McCoy was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. But the story didn't end there. In 1974, McCoy escaped from prison using a homemade fake gun carved from dental paste, hijacked a garbage truck, and drove it through the prison gates. He remained on the run for 3 months before being killed in a shootout with FBI agents in Virginia. Years later, a former FBI agent co-authored a book titled D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, claiming Richard McCoy was Cooper all along. The theory gained traction. Both men were military trained, skilled with parachutes, familiar with aircraft. Both pulled off nearly identical hijackings using rear air stairs on Boeing 727s. And both chose nearly the same altitude, speed, and aircraft configuration. But the FBI disagreed. Here's why. McCoy was 27 in 1972. Witnesses described Cooper as being in his mid-40s in 1971. Cooper left no fingerprints. McCoy left several. McCoy was sloppy, leaving physical evidence behind. Cooper was meticulous. And most importantly, McCoy was ruled out by DNA testing later in the investigation. Still, for many, McCoy remains the closest anyone ever came to matching Cooper's profile. But he wasn't the only suspect. Several others rose to the top of the FBI's long list. Small Blue Diamond Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Orient employee and World War II paratrooper. After the hijacking, he suddenly paid off debt, bought land, and lived modestly in Washington. He matched the general description. In 2003, his brother came forward, claiming Kenneth had once said, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." Though suspicious, the FBI dismissed him. Christensen was shorter and thinner than Cooper's description, and no physical evidence tied him to the case. Small Blue Diamond Dwayne Weber. In 1995, just before his death, Weber allegedly told his wife, "I'm Dan Cooper." She later found notes in his diary referencing a sore knee, similar to Cooper's supposed limp, and saw that he had once stayed at a Portland area hotel near the airport. FBI testing on DNA from Cooper's tie, however, did not match Weber's profile. He was ruled out. Small Blue Diamond William Gossett, a former Army veteran and survivalist. Gossett allegedly told his sons he was Cooper, had experience with parachuting, and even conducted mock hijackings in training. He fit the age and physical description and had legal and financial troubles around the time of the hijacking. But no forensic evidence ever supported his claims, and many believed his story was a fabrication. In 2001, the FBI made one of its most significant forensic moves. They extracted DNA from Cooper's tie, which had been left on his seat after the jump. Using mitochondrial DNA, a limited form of identification, they compared it to several top suspects, including Weber, Gossett, and McCoy. None were matches. Worse, since Cooper had bought his ticket using a fake name, and because fingerprint analysis from the plane produced no usable prints, the case began to stall once again. With every suspect ruled out by science, the Bureau faced a new challenge. The public was losing faith, and amateur sleuths were just getting started. Online forums exploded. Authors released self-published books with wild theories. CooperCon, a yearly gathering of researchers, pilots, and investigators, was launched in the Pacific Northwest. Private detectives filed FOIA requests. Reddit threads analyzed photos of suspects' ears. People were even testing DNA on recovered bills to look for skin oil or fibers. But the FBI, after 45 years, still had no one they could definitively name as D.B. Cooper. The case file was thousands of pages long. Hundreds of suspects had been questioned. Dozens of false confessions had come and gone. None led anywhere. And in July 2016, after more than 4 decades, the Bureau announced it was suspending active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case, though it remained technically open. By that point, the case had shifted from federal manhunt to cultural obsession. Do you believe the real D.B. Cooper is one of these men? Or did the FBI miss someone hiding in plain sight? Over 50 years have passed since a man calling himself Dan Cooper skyjacked Northwest Orient Flight 305, demanded a ransom of $200,000, then parachuted into the night. And yet, remarkably, the mystery remains unsolved. The FBI's official investigation, known internally as NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, spanned 45 years, making it the longest and most exhaustive manhunt in the agency's history. On July 8, 2016, the Bureau made a historic announcement. They were officially closing the active investigation. Their reason: a lack of credible leads and a need to redirect resources to more pressing threats, including terrorism and modern aviation crimes. But that wasn't quite the end. The FBI clarified that the case was not closed in the traditional sense. They would continue to accept physical evidence should any arise, particularly items directly linked to Cooper himself. The missing parachute, pieces of his clothing, the briefcase he carried, or any additional bundles of the ransom money. Their online tip portal for the case remained open. By that time, the NORJAC files had swelled to over 60 volumes, filled with thousands of documents, hundreds of interviews, and reports analyzing over 800 suspects. Yet not a single piece of conclusive evidence ever emerged to confirm who D.B. Cooper really was, or what became of him. Still, the hijacking left a permanent imprint on airline security in the U.S. Shortly after the 1971 incident, Boeing developed and installed a device now called the Cooper vane, a small mechanical modification that prevents the rear air stair of Boeing's 727 aircraft from being lowered in flight. This meant no future hijacker could attempt the same daring escape Cooper did. Airlines also revised their boarding and security policies. Cockpit doors began to include peepholes to monitor cabin activity. Eventually, following the September 11th attacks, reinforced cockpit doors and the presence of air marshals became standard across major U.S. carriers. In a way, D.B. Cooper's brazen act helped accelerate the transformation of air travel into what we know today, with layered security checks, tighter protocols, and zero-tolerance policies for threats on board. Yet none of that answered the burning question: who was he? The man had seemingly outwitted the FBI, the airline, radar systems, and nature itself. No body was ever found. No parachute. No personal effects. Just a decaying bundle of $20 bills, found 9 years later by a young boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River, matching serial numbers from the ransom. The case became legend. Books, documentaries, and dramatizations followed. Amateur sleuths formed online communities dedicated to solving the puzzle. Some even held yearly conventions in the Pacific Northwest to trade theories and celebrate the most famous unidentified fugitive in American history. But beyond the myths and theories, one truth remains. The FBI's final word. We haven't closed the case, but we've run out of credible leads. So we're left to wonder, did D.B. Cooper die somewhere in the cold, wooded expanse of the Pacific Northwest? A failed escape, a forgotten skeleton beneath the moss? Or did he live, quietly, cleverly, under a new identity, reading the headlines about himself and smiling as the world searched in vain? And if he survived, how did he disappear so completely, so perfectly, that not a single person ever came forward in over 5 decades? What's your theory? Was D.B. Cooper a master escape artist, or a ghost lost to the forest? Let us know what you think in the comments. Is this really the end of the investigation, or just another dead end? Let us know your theory in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow every twist in this unsolved case. By the time the FBI officially stepped back from the Cooper case in 2016, many assumed the trail had gone cold for good. But outside of government walls, the mystery never rested. In fact, in the years leading up to and after the FBI's announcement, a new generation of sleuths emerged, armed not just with theories, but with cutting-edge tools. One of the most promising breakthroughs came from something Cooper left behind, his black tie. During the hijacking in 1971, Cooper had worn a dark clip-on JCPenney tie. After the passengers were released and the crew deplaned in Seattle, investigators found the tie still draped across a seat. They bagged it for evidence. For decades, it sat stored away. But in 2007, with advances in forensic analysis, scientists revisited the item. Enter Tom Kay, a respected paleontologist turned forensic hobbyist. He formed a volunteer group known as Citizen Sleuths, composed of scientists, engineers, and investigators fascinated by the Cooper case. With the FBI's approval, they gained access to the tie. Using powerful electron microscopes, Kay and his team discovered minute particles of pure titanium, rare earth elements like cerium, strontium sulfide, and aluminum, all embedded in the fabric. These weren't random dust particles. They pointed to a very specific environment, one associated with aerospace manufacturing or high-tech chemical engineering. Titanium, especially in the early 1970s, wasn't common. It was used in jet aircraft, radar components, and advanced industrial equipment. The microscopic scale and combination of elements suggested the particles had come from a controlled manufacturing setting, possibly where high-performance metals were cut or fabricated. This shifted everything. If Cooper had worn that tie regularly, it might mean he worked in or near an aerospace or chemical facility, perhaps one involved with defense contracts, narrowing the pool of potential suspects. But Kay didn't stop at the tie. From 2011 to 2018, his team combed over old FBI files, aerial maps, and drop zone wind data. They used digital terrain modeling to reanalyze Cooper's jump area, wind drift, and possible landing points, work that suggested earlier FBI theories might have misjudged the escape path. They also used satellite imaging, declassified radar logs, and historical weather data to reconstruct the storm that night. Their findings hinted Cooper may have jumped closer to the Washougal River, east of Vancouver, Washington, not near Ariel, Washington, as initially believed. The discoveries energized amateur investigators worldwide. Online communities on forums like Reddit, the D.B. Cooper Forum, and various true crime blogs began sharing maps, suspect lists, and analysis. In parallel, the rise of genetic genealogy, the same science that cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018, reignited hope. Could a touch DNA sample from the tie or a potential fingerprint on the cigarette butts, long lost now, lead to a distant cousin or family match? By then, a new wave of potential suspects had also come into focus, not from confession, but from posthumous clues, family tips, and military connections. L.D. Cooper, named by his niece, Marla Cooper, who claimed she overheard him planning the hijacking as a child. Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran and skilled pilot with a criminal record and a knack for faking identities. Walter Rica, a Michigan man whose friend claimed he confessed on tape before dying in 2014. None of these names, however, ever led to conclusive evidence. But science was now the main character. Despite FBI silence, independent labs offered to test fabric samples, fingerprint residue, and skin oils, anything that could still speak from the past. The hope was clear. If they couldn't find Cooper alive, perhaps modern tools could find where he came from. The tie, the particles, the drop zone data. The mystery had evolved from myth into data points, a digital cold case waiting for the right equation. And so, the question lingers in the air like the storm clouds over Washington that night. Could a decades-old mystery still be cracked by 21st century science? Do you believe DNA or forensic tech could finally unmask D.B. Cooper? Or is it already too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The name D.B. Cooper evokes an image. Dark suit, sunglasses, a briefcase full of cash. The rear stairs of a Boeing 727 dropping him into the night. Decades later, the man himself remains unnamed, but his legacy is unmistakable. On November 24, 1971, Cooper hijacked Boeing 727-100 Flight 305, extorted $200,000 and parachuted into near darkness over southwestern Washington. He vanished. Few cases in U.S. criminal history carry quite the blend of audacity, mystery, and legend. He was a criminal, he threatened a bomb, demanded ransom, hijacked a plane. Yet he harmed no passengers, executed a plan so bold it still echoes, and walked away. That dual nature made him more myth than man. The real factual trail ends in Waters and Woods. $5,800 of the ransom money found in 1980 along the Columbia River. No conclusive body, no confirmed identity. The myth grows where the facts stop. Cooper's story seeped into popular culture. A 2022 Netflix limited series, D.B. Cooper, Where Are You?, explored his disappearance and legacy. Documentaries like The Mystery of D.B. Cooper, 2020 delve deeper. Books from Skyjack, The Hunt for D.B. Cooper to D.B. Cooper and Flight 305 have chronicled the event. The tale appeals, equal parts criminal caper and enduring enigma. In the Pacific Northwest, the legacy becomes local folklore. The small town of Ariel, Washington, near the suspected drop zone, celebrates D.B. Cooper Days on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, with costumes, music, and homage to the Skyjacker. The festival and related merchandise, bars and events show how deeply Cooper has lodged himself into local and national memory. The incident didn't vanish with the money, it changed aviation. After Cooper's jump, the FAA and aircraft manufacturers moved quickly. Boeing 727s were retrofitted with a device known as the Cooper vane to prevent the aft air stair from being lowered in flight. Airport security also tightened. Passenger screening, baggage checks, and new protocols became more rigorous. The hijackings of the late 1960s, early 1970s numbered over 100 in 3 years. Cooper's escape indirectly helped prompt change. He demanded $200,000. Only about $5,800 of that money was ever recovered. He jumped from the plane somewhere over rural Washington and was never definitively found. He remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in U.S. commercial aviation. Investigators believe the active part of the case closed in 2016 after 45 years, but public interest has spanned over 50 years since the act itself. And yet, we don't know his name, his fate, or if he walked away alive. Why does this case still captivate? Perhaps because the key questions remain open. Did he survive? Did he live quietly under a new identity? Or did he die in the wilderness and just vanish into myth? It's the space between what we know and what we don't that keeps the fascination alive. He stepped into the sky and left behind a mystery for the ages. Who was D.B. Cooper, and did he get away with it? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most enduring mysteries, like and share this video, subscribe for more true crime deep stories, and hit the notification bell so you'll be first to know when we uncover the next case that refuses to be forgotten.